Hi there, this is a Tutor to You MCQ revision blast. We're going to be looking at approaches. This is test number 6, which means there's 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 also available if you want to check those out too. Just in terms of how this works, 15 multiple choice questions is what we're going to work through. The multiple choice question, we're just using this format just so basically we can talk around some of these answers, so not necessarily the kind of MCQ format you'd see in the exam. When I've gone through each question, pause it, take your time to think about your answer. We'll go through the answers, like I say, I'll talk around them a little bit and keep your score as you go along. See how much of approaches you actually know. Okay, we're going to get started then with question number 1, which is what year did Wundt open the first experimental psychology lab? Is it 1876, 1877, 1878 or 1879? So pause your video. Correct answer here is D. Now, this is listed under the emergence of psychology as a science on your specification. So the lab itself was called the Institute for Experimental Psychology, and it was opened at the University of Leipzig in Germany. Now, we often describe the opening of this lab as where psychology was really born, because it moved psychology beyond its more philosophical roots, because it started to use the scientific method to begin to study the mind. Okay, staying with Wundt then, which of these is not relevant to Wundt? Liked introspection, used controlled methods, experimented on animals, or structuralism? So pause your video. Correct answer there is C. So what did Wundt actually do in his lab? Well, he was really big on the use of what we call introspection, which is the observing and examining of one's own conscious thoughts and emotions. The reason we use introspection is to gain insight into mental processes. So he used introspection as a tool to analyse an experience in terms of sensation, emotions, etc. So structuralism is a term that's also on here, and structuralism is just basically the study of the elements of consciousness. So some say that Wundt is not only the father of psychology, but also of structuralism. Now, it's basically from Wundt that cognitive psychologists could then develop their own controlled ways of studying internal mental processes. So 6-mark questions around Wundt are going to expect you to show knowledge of his role in the emergence of psychology as a science, the moving from philosophy into psychology because of the use of controlled methods, the use of introspection, and also paving the way for the rest of psychology. Okay, number 3. On to biological now. Which 2 of these describe phenotype? A, unique genetic makeup, B, expression of genes, C, influenced by environment, or D, coded in chromosomes? So pause your video. Okay, the correct answer that we're looking for is B and C, so hopefully you read the question, looking for 2. Genotype and phenotype are both named on the spec under the biological approach. Let's take a look at these. So your phenotype is the expression of your genetic makeup, which is your genotype, that can be influenced by the environment, whereas your genotype is your unique genetic makeup that's coded in your chromosomes, it's fixed at conception, but the expression of your genotype is influenced by environmental factors and then becomes your phenotype. So these 2 terms are very, very interrelated in that sense. You can't really describe genotype without phenotype, and also vice versa. And really, if you think about it, the distinction between genotype and phenotype links really, really nicely into the nature-nurture debate as well. Question 4. Which of these is not related to the biological approach? A, genes, B, evolution, C, neurochemistry, D, free will? Pause your video. Right, the correct answer that we're looking for there is free will. So let's just break down expectations then about the biological approach. So as well as genotype and phenotype that we've already mentioned, there's a number of other areas in the bio approach. Just make sure you're up to speed on. So we've got genes and their influence. So think about making reference here to like twin studies and family studies. We've got biological structures and neurochemistry and their influence. Some really nice links here back into psychopathology, where you can link back to biological explanations and treatments of OCD, perhaps talk about the role of serotonin and dopamine. And then we've got evolution and behaviour. So this is going to link to Darwin's theory of natural selection, but there is also a really nice link you could make here into attachment, talking about Bowlby and his evolutionary explanation of attachment. We've got Lorenz as well that you could use there too. Question 5. Which of these researchers is not named on the specification for approaches? So we've got Bandura, Skinner, Watson and Rayner, or Pavlov. Okay, so pause your video. All right, so the correct answer here is C, Watson and Rayner. And that's not to say that you can't use Watson and Rayner in a behaviourist answer, of course you can. It's just that Bandura, Skinner and Pavlov are named under kind of what we've got SLT and behaviourist here. So the question there is how have they contributed? And I've just stuck that there because we've seen questions in this area that ask you to discuss the contribution of certain researchers to their approach, or the contribution of an approach to our understanding of human behaviour. So if we take Pavlov and Skinner in terms of the behaviourist approach, contribution in this context basically means addressing the impact that their work, or if you're just looking at the approach, that approach has had. So there's many positives that we can say about the research of these two in terms of the use of the scientific method, the usefulness of research in terms of phobias, for example, the two-process model, or education, perhaps in terms of token economy. And we've got issues in terms of the lack of free will. We've also got the issue of extrapolation with the research on animals and then comparing that to humans. And then we can also pull in comparisons as well with other approaches should need be. For example, comparison between the behaviourist approach and the cognitive approach. Cognitive approach inserts that thought process between the stimulus response explanation that was suggested by the behaviourist. The key thing really here is just to know what the research is, but also be prepared to discuss it in these kind of contribution type questions. Question 5. Which of these is not a mediational process? Is it A, reconstruction, B, retention, C, attention, D, motivation? So pause your video. Right, your correct answer here is A. So we'll just break this down just by pulling in an example here. So the one that was missing off there was reproduction. Right, so imagine a little girl and she's watching her mum put on some lipstick. Very gender stereotype there. Anyway, so she pays attention to her mum applying the lipstick. She perhaps sees a nice positive reaction that she gets from her dad. Now she remembers this, so that's the retention part, is actually remembering it. 3, she knows where the lipstick is. She can perhaps reach it, so she's able to reproduce that behaviour. Of course, if she couldn't reach the lipstick, if it was out of her way, she'd have problems in terms of reproduction. And then finally, motivation. So she probably wants to imitate her mum. You could also talk about the fact that she's likely to identify with her mother more because it's a same-sex role model. And basically, she wants to get the compliments just like her mum did. Now, the application of SLT, and particularly the mediational process in STEM questions, is actually quite straightforward if you just take each process at a time. 7. Which of the following debates does not apply to the behaviourist approach? So A, reductionist, B, deterministic, C, nurture, or D, ideographic. So which of them doesn't apply to the behaviourist approach? Pause the video. Okay, the correct answer there is D. We put this on because debates can make for some nice AO3 as well. So let's just take a look at each of these. So in terms of reductionism, we've got what we call environmental reductionism, or you might know it as stimulus response reductionism. The behaviourists, of course, assume that all behaviour can be reduced down to the simple building blocks of stimulus response associations, and that any set of complex behaviours are just a series of stimulus response chains. In terms of determinism, we've got environmental determinism, which is the idea that behaviour is determined by forces that are outside of the individual. So if you like, environmental determinism says that our behaviour might be caused through previous experience, through classical and operant conditioning. Now, nurture is pretty straightforward, so the role of environmental factors to human development and behaviour. So why no free will then with the behaviourist approach? It's basically saying that your behaviour is a result of the environment you are in. Skinner actually said that as new evidences of predictable behaviour are discovered by science, no one will be exempt from complete determinism. So he believed wholeheartedly in the fact that you had no free will at all. You can't get more anti-free will than Skinner, but then he did teach a pigeon how to fly a bomb. Anyway, right, on to schemas. So a schema can be described as, is it A, building blocks of knowledge, B, change through experience, C, mental shortcuts, or D, all of the above? So pause the video. Right, the correct answer there is D. So schemas are in the cognitive approach, and they're basically a cognitive framework. They allow us to organise and interpret information. We develop them through experience, and they affect our cognitive process, and that's how we process information. The great thing about them, though, is they help save us time. So, for example, you have a restaurant schema, and it tells you what happens when you go into a restaurant. And you've got this schema because you've been to a few restaurants and then you've built up this knowledge. So if you're like me, the first time you went to Nando's, it was really confusing because it didn't fit with your normal restaurant schema, because you had to go up and order your own food, you had to collect your own sauce, you had to serve your own drinks. So when you left Nando's, your restaurant schema in your head got updated so that the next time you walked into a new restaurant, you could kind of look at it and say, well, do I need to serve myself? Do I need to go and get my own sauce? Because the experience had updated that schema for you. 8. Which part of the cognitive approach is being described here? Conclusions reached on the basis of evidence and reasoning. Is that A, theoretical model, B, inference, C, schema, or D, computer model? So pause it. Okay, the answer here is B. So these are the key components of the cognitive approach that you have to know. Theoretical model, inference, computer model, and we've looked at schemas already in the last question. So an inference is when you come to a conclusion based on what you know. So with cognitive psychology, you can't see the thoughts in the brain, although I guess you could argue with the emergence of cognitive neuroscience, we're getting closer to that. So the way that cognitive psychologists study is to study these thoughts indirectly and then make an inference about what we think is going on. Now, computer models are based on the analogy of seeing the brain much like a computer, that's to say operating in a similar way. The great thing about the computer models in cognitive psychology, if you wanted to talk about a usefulness perhaps for an evaluation, is that they've been hugely important in terms of the development of artificial intelligence. Theoretical models, like computer models, are also used just to study the internal mental processes, and they make representations of the steps involved in internal mental processes. So, for example, like an information processing model. Question 10 on psychodynamic now. Which of the following is not a defense mechanism? A, repression, B, denial, C, thanatos, or D, displacement? So which is not a defense mechanism? Pause the video. Okay, your correct answer there is C. So thanatos is actually the Freudian death instinct. You might have come across it if you'd studied aggression. So what are defense mechanisms? They're basically unconscious strategies that your ego uses to manage anxiety. And it manages anxiety basically by redirecting psychic energy, and it does these in a number of ways. So you have to know these three. You have to know that repression involves burying an unpleasant thought or desire into the unconscious. For example, you might take something traumatic that happened, repress it, and so ultimately you can forget it. Denial is where you take something that's threatening, so perhaps a thought, and you ignore it and treat it as if it weren't true. For example, a wife might find evidence that a husband's cheating on her, but just dismiss it and provide other reasons or explanations for her husband's behaviour. Displacement is where emotions are directed away from their source or target towards something different. So, for example, a boss gives his employee a hard time at work and the employee goes home and shouts at his wife. Because usually with displacement, we displace it onto something more socially acceptable. So the employee probably wouldn't shout back at his boss. All right, sticking with Freud then, which psychosexual stage is being described here? Fixation at this stage could lead to smoking or overeating. Is it phallic, oral, anal, or latency? So pause your video. All right, your correct answer here is oral, and it says there, can you detail these stages? We do have to know the psychosexual stages. So psychosexual stages are oral, anal, phallic, latency, and general. So Freud had this belief that humans progress through a number of different psychosexual stages during the development of the psyche, and he named 5 of these. So in the oral stage, which is around kind of 0 to 8 months, you get kind of characteristic oral behaviour, kind of sucking, etc. The anal stage, which is about 18 months to 3.5 years, is a stage where it's kind of holding or discarding feces. You've got some kind of element of control coming in at that stage. The phallic stage is about 3.5 to 6 years, is a fixation on the genitals, where you start to realise that your genitals are perhaps different to other people's. The latency stage, which is 6 years up until puberty, is where sexual urges are repressed, and then the genital stage, puberty onwards, is where these sexual urges then reawaken. So Freud claimed that during the development through these stages, a child can become fixated on one of these stages, which could then lead to specific psychological disorders. So fixation occurs because of kind of under or over gratification at a particular stage. So within the phallic stage, Freud said you needed to resolve your Oedipus complex if you were a boy, and then Jung said electro complex for a girl, because Freud kind of ignored that. And the reason that you needed to do this was in order to obtain your gender identity. So you might have come across the case study of little hands, and that can be used to demonstrate the Oedipus complex and how Freud then resolved the Oedipus complex of little hands through dream analysis. Next one. Which is the correct order, top to bottom, for Maslow's hierarchy of needs after self-actualization? So you're going to put in 4 answers here, so you might go D, C, B, E. So after self-actualization, what comes below that, below that, below that, and then below that? So pause the video. Okay, what you should have then is B, C, D, then A. Right. Maslow's hierarchy of needs, this is part of humanistic, is a theory of human motivation, and he presented the needs in this 5-level sequence where you had your basic needs at the bottom that needed to be met before this kind of higher psychological needs. So Maslow said that we're motivated to achieve certain needs, but there's an order to these needs, that certain needs are prioritised over another. So an individual can't self-actualise if the self-esteem, love and belonging, safety and physiological hasn't been met. So basically we can't do anything until our basic physiological needs are met, which kind of has face validity in the sense that think how difficult it is to try and do something if you're tired or you're cold or you're hungry. Number 13. Which humanistic concept is being described here? Ideal self and actual experience are very similar. Is it A, conditions of worth, B, the self, C, free will, or D, congruence? A, B, C, or D? Pause the video. Right, your correct answer here is congruence. We'll take a look at this. So this is about Rogers. So Rogers, like Maslow, was also a humanist psychologist, and he basically agreed with what Maslow said. But Rogers maintained that self-actualization was really dependent upon being an environment that gave someone acceptance. So acceptance is that unconditional positive regard. And for Rogers, this was so important. This means that self-actualization is basically when a person's ideal self, that's to say who they would like to be, is congruent, i.e. matches, with their actual behaviour, so their self-image. So incongruence is when these two are out of sync. Rogers used the term fully functioning to describe who a person who's actualizing. And he said childhood experience is the main factor that basically determines whether or not we become self-actualized. And the reason is that it's so important is this is where we get those conditions of worth placed on us. So the things that say, I will only be loved if. And this is the opposite of that unconditional positive regard, so loving somebody regardless. 14. Which of these is not a valid comparison of the biological and behavioural approach? Got A, B, C and D, and pause your video. Okay, the correct answer here is A, both are nature. Obviously they're not. So let's have a look at these. So we've got both the deterministic, they both argue that behaviour is outside of our free will. Biological, saying it's largely determined by internal factors, so genes and biology, and behaviour, our environment, so external factors. We've got both the nomothetic. In case you don't know what nomothetic means, it comes from the Greek word nomos, which means law. So it's about psychologists who are interested in establishing general laws and principles, and they do this through studying large groups of people, and they use statistical quantitative techniques to analyse their data. They're both reductionist. So reductionist is the belief that human behaviour can be explained by breaking it down into simpler component parts. So for biological, those parts might be, for example, neurotransmitters, and for behavioural, the environmental influences. And then obviously we've got nature versus nurture is a difference in terms of these two approaches, with the biological on the nature side and the behavioural on the nurture side. Final question, another comparison. Which of these is not a valid comparison of the cognitive and psychodynamic approach? Have a look at those and pause the video. All right, your correct answer there is B. Both are equally scientific. They're not. So the biggest issue with the psychodynamic approach is this problem of falsifiability. Karl Popper said that science should be about trying to find evidence against what our theory is. And this is why we test the null hypothesis in research. Now with the psychodynamic approach, this is impossible. Take, for example, an individual who was told by Freud they had an Oedipus complex, and their response was to say, no, I don't. Now, rather than just accept the theory as false, Freud could just then argue that they were in denial. Little quote from Popper here, which is quite cool. He said, insofar as scientific statement speaks about reality, it must be falsifiable. And insofar as it is not falsifiable, it does not speak about reality. That's Popper on Freud, basically. Just with these last couple of questions, just think about what we've done for the comparison here. We've basically done a comparison based on issues and debates, and it's a very nice way to structure your answer. So just look at the similarities between them and the differences based around on issues and debates. Little top tips to finish off. Don't be scared of introspection. We went through Wundt at the beginning. It's really not that bad. Use your knowledge from other topics, so draw in other areas. We talked about bringing Bowlby in, for example, for evolution. Knowing your spec is inside out in terms of what goes where and what exactly you're required to know. And finally, don't flunk the comparisons. Go down the issues and debates route. It's a really nice route for comparisons. All right, good luck.